Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into an impartial, detailed breakdown of a recent, highly discussed interview with One Nation leader Pauline Hanson. We are going to unpack the exact policies and political strategies she laid out, directly from the source material. Whether you follow politics closely or you just want to understand the shifting dynamics of the Australian electorate, this explainer is designed to cut right through the noise. We're going to break down exactly how One Nation proposes to reshape Australian policy, making these complex political strategies crystal clear. Okay, let's look at our roadmap for today. We've got 5 sections. First, political momentum and polling. Second, resources and sovereign wealth. Third, taxation and small business. Fourth, cutting government spending. And finally, the path forward. Let's get to it. Section 1, political momentum and polling. Gaining ground in the electorate. 59. That number is absolutely central to One Nation's current narrative. In her recent interview, Hanson pointed to a Redbridge poll published in the Financial Review that controversially projected up to 59 lower house seats for her party if an election were held today. Now, she knows it's just a poll, but she backs it up with some hard numbers. Take the recent Far by-election. They grabbed 40% of the primary vote there, which is a massive indicator of shifting voter sentiment in regional areas. Plus, they recently won 7 seats in South Australia. So if you're tracking Aussie politics, these are the exact figures One Nation is using to claim voters are hungry for a major disruption. So what's driving this? Well, Hanson really leans into the conversation she's having with constituents. She literally quoted voters saying, "We need you. You're our last hope. We've got to turn this country around." She uses this to frame One Nation as the ultimate fix for everyday Australians who feel, quite frankly, destitute. She argues that the skyrocketing cost of living and current Labor government policies, especially those hitting the mining and agriculture sectors, are pushing voters her way. It's a highly emotional framing, positioning the party not just as an alternative on the ballot, but literally as a last hope for people feeling totally left behind. Moving on to Section 2, Resources and Sovereign Wealth, the 30% equity proposal. Now, what's really interesting here is the contrast between 2 very different approaches. On one hand, you have the famous Norway model, a state-owned setup that has built a staggering sovereign wealth fund of nearly $3 trillion over the decades. It's massive. But Hanson's proposal for Australia is quite different. She's pushing for a maximum 30% government equity share in new exploration and production, leaving the remaining 70% in the hands of private companies. And she made a point in the interview to clarify what this isn't. It's not coercion, it's not a hostile takeover, and she insists it's definitely not socialism. Instead, it's framed as an optional partnership, where taxpayers get a direct slice of the nation's natural resource wealth. But how do you actually get companies to sign up for that? Well, One Nation's carrot is a promise to guarantee a decision on resource projects in just 6 months. To pull that off, Hanson says they take an absolute axe to bureaucracy. We're talking cutting red tape, green tape for environmental hurdles, black tape, and even blue UN tape. A huge part of this is her promise to completely abolish the safeguard mechanism, which is the current baseline for industrial emissions. The goal? Supercharging project approvals and assessing environmental needs strictly on a case-by-case basis. So let's say they get this 30% equity stake. Where exactly does all that money go? Hanson is crystal clear on this. It would go straight into a dedicated sovereign wealth fund with 3, and only 3, authorized uses. 1, paying down the national debt. 2, funding critical infrastructure. And 3, bolstering defense. The absolute key takeaway here is her firm, non-negotiable stance that these funds will not go into general consolidated revenue. No way. She argues that throwing it into the general pot just guarantees it'll be wasted by current or future governments. Okay, Section 3, Taxation and Small Business. Rewarding hard work. This brings us to a really personal story from the interview. Before she ever stepped foot in politics, Hanson says she borrowed everything she had to start a business, working a grueling 80 to 90 hours a week to get it off the ground. She uses this intense personal experience as the bedrock for her policy stance, passionately arguing that people absolutely have to be rewarded for their hard work. Because she lived it, she fundamentally rejects the idea that any government has the right to, as she puts it, reach into a business owner's pocket and snatch half their profits after doing absolutely zero heavy lifting to help build that enterprise. And that very philosophy translates directly into One Nation's tax platform. The party is looking to completely reverse recent budget changes to the capital gains tax, and they're pushing hard to index income tax rates. Hanson's argument is that Australia has somehow become the most heavily taxed country on Earth. And here's a fascinating little aside. She actually claims that major Liberal Party players like Angus Taylor are, quote, just catching up to policies and private members' bills that she envisioned and introduced to Parliament years in advance.
Section 4, Cutting Government Spending, Reining in the Budget.
Now, if you're going to cut taxes, you have to pay for it somewhere, right? So the crucial point is this staggering figure, $50 billion. According to Hanson, that's what Australia is coughing up every single year just in interest on the national debt. Just the interest. She calls this level of debt completely unserviceable. In fact, she issued a pretty stark warning that if we don't rein in this overspending, Australia is at real risk of sliding into a third world country status. That massive $50 billion price tag is the absolute core justification for the heavy budget cuts her party wants to roll out. To actually fix that balance sheet, One Nation has a hit list of specific targets. First up, they want to completely abolish the Climate Change Department. Second, when it comes to health and education, they're aiming to slash what they see as incredibly costly duplication between state and federal levels. Third, with the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, they plan to aggressively target and weed out individuals they label as scammers, while supposedly leaving genuine users untouched. And finally, they want to completely defund and eliminate what Hanson referred to in the interview as the Aboriginal industry. So as you can hear, these are the highly aggressive reforms they argue are necessary to stop out-of-control spending.
And that brings us to our final segment, Section 5, The Path Forward, Strategy and Coalitions. It really all boils down to this pivotal question the interviewer asked. What exactly is the price of a coalition? Think about it. If One Nation and the Liberal National Coalition actually snagged enough combined numbers to form a government, what would Pauline Hanson demand to sign on the dotted line? Well, her answer gave us a look at a very strict, no-compromise negotiation playbook. Her stance here is unbelievably blunt, especially when she brought up Angus Taylor. She flat out said, "I'm not going to tie myself to that dog that will not be able to follow through on his promises to the Australian people." Hanson has this deep-seated wariness of the quote-unquote moderates and progressives inside the Liberal Party. She's convinced those internal factions will totally paralyze the leadership from keeping conservative promises. Because of that, she refuses to tie her party's fate to a leadership team she simply doesn't trust. For her, a coalition isn't about standard political compromise, it's a strict demand for adherence to her core policies. And these points brilliantly illustrate exactly what those non-negotiable demands look like. One Nation insists any partnership must be built on these core pillars: further industry development, supercharging manufacturing growth, prioritizing agricultural production, giving ironclad support to the mining industry, and pushing a cultural commitment to end what Hanson calls woke ideology. To her, these aren't just bullet points on a manifesto. She views them as the absolute foundational bedrock required to restore national pride, respect for the flag, and a decent standard of living for future generations. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a pretty massive question to chew on. We've impartially unpacked the polling hype, the 30% resource equity pitch, the sweeping spending cuts, and those ironclad coalition conditions. But how might these proposed populist policies practically reshape the Australian political landscape if a coalition scenario actually comes to pass? It's a giant puzzle, and it's worth thinking deeply about how these interconnected policies might shift the entire future of the electorate. Thank you so much for joining us as we unpack this source material, and as always, keep questioning the details.